The French film The Anatomy of a Fall won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 2023. That's one of the most prestigious honours in the world of cinema. It's been nominated and is winning all sorts of other prizes and awards and honours all across the world. Now, if you like dramatic criminal investigations and courtroom dramas, you're definitely going to like it. And if you like thinking deeply about the nature of truth and the limits of human knowledge, you're going to love it even more. Either way, Anatomy of a Fall is a great film, one to put on your shortlist. Stay tuned and you'll find out more. Welcome to Pink Door Culture Club, your eclectic entertainment guide. My name is Jeremiah Burns. This week, as I mentioned at the very top, we're looking at the 2023 French film Anatomy of a Fall. It's directed and co-written by Justine Triet, starring Sandra Hüller. Even if you don't watch international films, I don't really watch international films. This is not my attempt to sort of seem more cultured than I really am. Even if this is not what you'd normally do, I would definitely recommend this one, and we'll get into why in a moment. I mean, I mentioned a few things at the top, but there's plenty to unpack here. If you're not familiar with the show, Pink Door Culture Club is a podcast and a YouTube show, and I've switched to releasing this every Thursday afternoon. The idea is that, if you're here in Australia or wherever you are, you could listen to it on a Friday and it will send you into your weekend, maybe with something to think about of what you might like to watch or reflect on. Along with these regular reviews, which are longer, I'm also publishing shorter form videos called Pop Culture Proverbs. They're coming out during the week, and they're kind of just little 1-minute clips with some wisdom for living inspired by whatever we've looked at the previous week. If you like the show, of course, it goes without saying, please make sure you subscribe, you share, you comment in the section here on YouTube or on the Facebook page, and also reach out and be in touch with me via that same Facebook page, or you can do that by emailing me at pinkdoorcultureclub@gmail.com. Well, the first segment of Pink Door Culture Club is called Spellbound, where we think about some of the strengths and maybe the weaknesses of Anatomy of a Fall. The first thing to say is the performances of the actors. These are refined, understated performances, and I think they really richly convey tension, inner turmoil, frustration, pain, and especially uncertainty. This is a film all about uncertainty. What happened? Who did it? Why did they do it? And Sandra Hüller as Sandra Voita, that's her character's name, also called Sandra. She is outstanding as the lead in this, and she's had a range of nominations and wins for her acting in the role. And there's plenty of other great actors, but I would also call out Milo Mercado Grainer, who plays Daniel, the son in this. He's also received a range of nominations for his performance. But perhaps even the best one is the border collie, the dog named Snoop. Now, we're going to hear a little bit more about him and his performance in another segment, but he is a character in this film, and he's really good and brings a lot of interest and heart to the film, and he performs really well. He's just a dog, but he performs really well. So definitely the performances are great. A second thing that's great about this film is the story arc and structure. Mostly this is a traditional linear kind of film. It goes from the beginning to the end. That has a good sense though of pace and momentum that maintains interest and drives things forward. It doesn't get bogged down. Even though this is 2.5 hours, it doesn't get bogged down in my view. There are some ventures back, or quite a few ventures back into the past, but the way they do that is really interesting. It's almost never through flashbacks, like a normal cinematic flashback. they do it through things like the police will do recreations of what happened, or lawyers will do recreations of the crime, or they'll sort of be looking at photographs of the past, or they'll be discussing the past, or someone will be recounting a memory. So it's the way they explore the past is very subjective, and that makes it interesting, as we'll talk about more in a little while. There is an extended venture into the past at the end, but the way they do that is that they have an audio recording of it, and so they kind of do then go and show it happening as well, but it's really based around an audio recording that's played to a courtroom. So again, there's a bit of an interesting angle on the flashback. It does mean, all of those different pieces mean that there's a lot of movement in terms of, at different points, who seems to be at fault and how that's being perceived. It reminded me of an Australian film from 1998 with Hugo Weaving called The Interview, where at different moments you think Hugo Weaving is, a mastermind criminal, and at other times you're like, oh, this guy's completely innocent. And it kind of shifts between those two. And, the usual suspects would be like a more Hollywood version of that. And it seems to be that a lot of recent true crime podcasts are all based around that as well. Sort of going back, retracing the past, trying to think the past through in a different way to the way that prosecutors or litigators did. It's a reminder, as with many good films, or maybe any good films, that if you're going to tell a story about universal themes or ideas, you really need to ground that at the micro level in characters that we get to know and characters that we feel for. And I think this movie does that really well. A third thing that's interesting and strong about this film is the multitude of cameras. So I just sort of talked through before, or just then, around the multitude of ways that they delve into the past, but there's also ways in which they present things on screen. So primarily it's the traditional lens of the director who's kind of framing things and shooting things, but you also have video from police interviews, you have videos from lawyers who are doing interviews, and you also have media reports. And then at other times, the camera tracks with the son, who is basically blind. And at other times, it tracks with the dog, who's also seeing things for himself as well. And that creates that and really develops that sense of multiple competing perspectives. You find yourself thinking about through which pair of eyes am I seeing these events? Whose perspective am I taking on as I watch this film? What's the agenda of that viewer or that actor? And I think that's a really clever way, again, of building a sophisticated sense of like competing ideas and narratives woven through the story. A fourth and final thing that I liked about this film is the music. The character of Daniel, or the son, he is practicing and playing the piano throughout the movie. And because he's learning, it's kind of slightly broken, staccato, discordant at times music, that it kind of hangs in the air. And it creates that sense of, okay, there are patterns, there's a rhythm and a rhyme, but it's not quite gelling. In fact, it's creating tension. It's kind of symbolic of a house that's filled with tension, and maybe even deception as well. There is like a traditional soundtrack, but sometimes that soundtrack is not there. Like at the end of the film, like right at the end, a traditional soundtrack kicks in, and it made me realize that, oh yeah, for the last 10, 15 minutes, there's been no soundtrack. And that is a bit unnerving, because again, it leaves you in a bit of a vacuum where you're so used to films telling you how to feel. Like, this is the scary bit, this is the happy bit, that when that soundtrack's not there, again, everything's quite ambiguous. It's not clear what you should feel. So when you put together the interesting ways of telling the past, the interesting camera angles, and this soundtrack, it really goes together to reinforce some of those themes. The second segment of Pink Door Culture Club is called Rear Window, and the idea is to look more closely and think more deeply about some of the themes and ideas arising from Anatomy of a Fall. And there's probably just 2 or 3 big things to explore here, but they are pretty significant. And the first one is epistemology, which is just a fancy word in philosophy for what can we know and how can we know it. It's the philosophy of knowledge. And I think this movie spells out some really interesting things. So one thing I think the movie's saying and exploring is there are different ways of knowing things. So at the very start, there is a journalist interviewing the main character, and she can hear music and noise coming from upstairs where the husband is, where Samuel is, but she never sees Samuel. So she hears him, she senses him, she senses the tension in the house, but she never sees him. Daniel, as the character who is blind that I mentioned before, obviously he can hear and he can speak, but he can't see. And then Snoop, the dog, well, he can see and he can hear, but he can't speak. And so there is this really rich theme of there are different ways of knowing, not just one way, it's not just a matter of seeing, it's also a matter of sensing in different ways. And another sort of idea being explored in this film is that language can extend or limit what we know. It can provide a particular way of knowing and a particular way of expressing what we know, and in that way it can also be a barrier to what we can know and access, because in the film Sandra is from Germany. She can obviously speak German, she can speak French fairly well, but it runs out at different points and she has to switch to English, which is a second language for her, but she's better at that than at French. And you can see her getting caught in not being able to express herself. Then at other points, people are imposing rules on her about how she must speak French at different points to different people. So it becomes an interesting exploration of how language can affect what we know and how we know and what we can express. Another aspect of this is that the film really explores the idea that there are times when we cannot know things that are really important with certainty. We cannot have certain knowledge. And as part of that, the way in which the same set of facts, the same data, can just be presented to support very different stories and very different conclusions. So early on, Sandra is focused on the facts, and she kind of says to her lawyer, look, the fact is this, that, and the other. And the lawyer is like, it doesn't matter. That's not the important thing. In this sort of situation, it's not so much the facts that matter. It's the way those facts are presented to people. It's the overarching story. It's how compelling that story is. And the great example in the film is they're kind of discussing the way in which some blood was spattered at the crime scene, and there's all these experts who have different accounts of how it must have been this. It can only be explained this way, and another expert who's got a completely different explanation of how it can only be this that explains it. So seemingly like objective facts, but spun in very different ways. And so there's lots of questions flowing through that of okay, which story makes the most sense? What story will people be most likely to believe? Which one is the most compelling narrative? And also a very explicit discussion at one point with the son about him making a choice about what to believe. As in, I've got facts 1, 2, and 3, and I've got facts 4, 5, and 6. The first 3 tell me this, the second 3 tell me that. I kind of just need to make a choice about what to believe. What do I desire to believe? What do I want to believe? So a very interesting sort of, investigation of knowing in that way. As you would have picked up through everything I've said so far, there's a lot about the role of the legal profession in this whole thing. So particularly presenting foreigners in a certain way, presenting women in a certain way. And this is probably just my ignorance because I'm so used to seeing American and Australian courts portrayed on screen. But like the French courtroom seems pretty quirky to me. Like the prosecutor is seated up next to the judge and the judge is conducting their own questioning all the way through. And I kept expecting the defense lawyers to object, but they almost never did. And it was like a far more fluid discussion rather than like you have a turn and then I have a turn. So like that was just more of a tangent, but definitely an interesting insight into that legal system and some themes there that would go with any legal system. I was thinking of the famous case involving Lindy Chamberlain in Australia, decades and decades ago, which was all about this. Like, we have these facts, how do we explain them? How do we tell the story? And what do people want to believe? And so obviously a famous case that eventually got overturned in that one as well. More generally, like that's kind of all grounded in the film. Interesting ideas. More generally, that kind of then led me to thinking about what society sees as valid ways of knowing. So it feels to me like our society, on the one hand, in the West, is really obsessed with scientific ways of knowing, sort of born out of the Enlightenment and modernism. And that makes sense because, like, look at what science has brought us and the scientific method, and that's great, and we want to be rational and fantastic, but I think there are limits to that as well. All right? There are truths that the scientific method cannot access. Science can't tell me if my wife loves me. Science can't tell me if Alexander the Great existed or not. Science can't even tell me if a particular action is moral or immoral. It could tell me the consequence of the action, but whether that consequence is moral or immoral, that's not a scientific question. That goes beyond science and is grounded in something else. And then it feels also like our society is kind of obsessed, on the other hand, with personal ways of knowing, which is like the postmodern movement, where if I believe something, it is true for me. And so we kind of end up with a society of my truth versus your truth, which is far more where this movie is kind of located, where it's not that the facts don't matter at all, but there's kind of a view that ultimately it's the story that will prevail, which is really, I think, a very postmodern idea that the facts are secondary to the story. The story is what really matters, which again, like, makes sense because there's some truth to it. But again, has got limitations as well, right? Where just because you believe something doesn't make it true. Belief doesn't actually, bring something into existence or make it true by itself. So I haven't fully resolved that line of thought, but that's what this movie made me think about, all the ways in which the legal profession and criminal proceedings sort of draw that out, and then more generally the way that our society deals with questions of epistemology, kind of torn between the old objective ideals and far more recent subjective ideals. And then a second and final thing that I was meditating on as I was watching this movie is on the nature of dysfunction in marriage. I've done a previous episode recently about the Beckham documentary and kind of talked through the Beckham playbook for a successful marriage. Well, you could kind of have a similar thing, but it would be the anatomy of a full recipe or playbook for a failed marriage. And I won't go through everything you would learn from this movie about that, but It really is a very rich and compelling view of marital dysfunction. I guess you've got that idea from the court case of battling narratives, and that comes through into marriage here in this movie as well. Like, marriage is the battleground of competing narratives. There are some things in the film that I think are really positive that they show about marriage. That, look, marriage is going to involve conflict. You have to be able to cope with conflict. You have to be able to discuss conflict and think about conflict in marriage. That's just a reality. Like, it's a very mature view of marriage in that way. It does involve interdependence. It does involve support, especially when you have hardship or grief. You are going to have to be able to help each other get through it. And there's the big thing in the movie is it has to involve compromise and neutral ground and shared space. So in the film, that's to do with giving ground when it comes to your career and where you will live and even what language you will speak. All of those things come through in the film as, good lessons for marriage, that you have to be able to deal with conflict. You have to be able to depend on each other. You have to be able to compromise and have some sort of shared or neutral space. However, where the film kind of ends up is highlighting that what marriage can't be, what a good or healthy marriage can't be, what it can't degenerate into is holding on to past grief and becoming absolutely obsessed with it. Like, you do have to find a way to move on. Not that you can necessarily process everything perfectly and every wound will be healed, but you have to be able to sort of make sense of past grief in some way so that you can move on in the relationship that is here and now. Marriage can't degenerate into refusing intimacy to the other person for the rest of time and then blaming them when they seek that intimacy elsewhere. Marriage can't degenerate into resenting, and this is a huge one in the film, it can't degenerate into resenting the success of the other person and then holding them responsible for your own lack of success. There's like a really compelling little case study here of failure as bitter, self-absorbed procrastination that blames everyone else, especially a spouse, and never takes responsibility. So I think apart from epistemology, this film is such a rich, compelling exploration of marriage and like what it needs to be and also what it can't be. The final segment of Pink Door Culture Club is called The Man Who Knew Too Much, where I just list off some other interesting trivia related to whatever we're looking at this week, Anatomy of a Fall. First thing to know is that Justine Triet wrote this film specifically or specially for Sandra Hüller, and it's their second collaboration. I imagine it's very gratifying as an actor to have someone like make a film just for you to be in. It'd be interesting to think about how that affects the creative process. Even more interesting is that on set, Hüller, the actor, constantly asked Triet, is this character guilty or not? But Triet refused to answer that question. Now I think that's really interesting, and that's part of why, it's got to be part of why this performance is so interesting and why that uncertainty kind of hangs all the way through the film. Here's an interesting quote from Triet. I really wanted to delve into issues of relationships and cohabitation. It was also a pretext to dissect every aspect of their lives. And this article goes on to say, Triet further expressed her fascination with the Amanda Knox case, wherein a young American woman was accused of murdering her roommate, Meredith Kercher, in Italy in 2007. So it's interesting to get a little insight into the mind of the co-writer and the director, that she's really trying to think through cohabitation and also draw upon true crime or a real case of someone being prosecuted in a foreign country, as we see in the film. All right, now the real trivia. For his role as Snoop, Border Collie Messi was awarded the Palme Dog at the 2023 Cannes Film Festival. Like, I had heard of the Palme d'Or, but there's the Palme Dog as well. Now, the Palme Dog Award is a yearly award presented by the International Film Critics during the Cannes Film Festival, begun in 2001 by Toby Rose. It is awarded to the best performance by a canine, live or animated, or group of canines. The award consists of a leather collar with the term Palme Dog. Bluey could get this award, right? There you go. Anyway, so like it wasn't just me who recognized the amazing work of this dog. And finally, an instrumental version of rapper 50 Cent's PIMP track, which is the sort of heavy hip-hop track you hear at the start of this film, and it comes up in the court case as well. It features the rapper Snoop Dogg, and the first character to appear in the film is the dog, whose name is Snoop. Anyway, as a dog lover, I loved these pieces of dog trivia. Okay, so that's it. We're at the end of this episode of Pink Door Culture Club. Overall, I think Anatomy of a Fall is a brilliant film. My reaction is like, this is a 5-star film, highly recommended. I'm not, like I said at the start, I'm not some kind of international film snob, guru, anything like that, but this was really gripping. Such great performances and such interesting, deep themes and ideas being explored throughout. As I mentioned at the top, remember that you can engage with the show as a YouTube show or as a podcast every Thursday afternoon, Australian time, and via some short form videos during the week as well. However you're engaging, make sure you like, you follow, you share, you comment, and all of that. And of course, feel free to be in touch with me via the Facebook page, or you can email me directly at pinkdoorcultureclub@gmail.com. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.